Hello, everybody, and happy holidays. This is our end of the year educational event, and we keep it short. You guys are probably busy, you probably have as much Christmas shopping to do as I do. And just wanted to talk briefly about what some of our plans are for next year and where we kind of directing my energies and the practice and whatnot. So, um, I've spent the last couple of 3 or 4 years really focused on building up the doctor training program and traveling around the world on a pretty regular basis, training doctors in functional medicine. And 2020 is kind of my year of the patient. I'm going to get back into the patient practice and focus on working with real folks with real problems. So if you or anyone you know need some help, I have my phone practice that we run out of kalishwellness.com and work with patients all over the world. What I'm doing now mostly is these more advanced labs that I talk quite a bit about, like ion panels and these complex microbiome tests. So that's kind of what I'm doing for 2020 is focusing on patients. And another project that's a sort of an outgrowth of the focusing on patients instead of doctors for next year is to start to introduce people to some of these ideas around meditation. So when I was 18 years old, I went to Japan. I lived in a Zen monastery for 6 months. Not your typical 18-year-old thing to do, but it was certainly quite an education. I'd say it was like a spiritual boot camp where you sit in a full lotus for 12 to 18 hours a day. There was a big Japanese guy walking around with a really big stick, and they actually do hit you with that big stick. That really does happen. And I learned a lot about discipline and meditation techniques and Zen meditation. Hardcore. It was under a man named Harada Roshi. Harada Roshi, one of the great Zen masters of the last 100 years or so. So I got to work with him directly. Quite an honor. Like I'm this 18-year-old kid, I didn't know what's going on. And I remember one of the times when I was in well, I lived in Japan with a man named I lived in a temple named Sangenji and with a man named Otsuka-san. And Otsuka was the senior student of Harada Roshi. So whenever Otsuka and I would go down to the main temple was called Bukokuji, many hours of drive away from where our temple was. But we drive down to the temple and Otsuka would be treated like royalty. And I remember other foreigners coming up to me like, who are you? How do you know these guys? How did you get in here? Like I had this really privileged position. I'm 18 years old. I had no clue what was going on. And so Harada Roshi kind of took me under his wing. He actually invited me to stay in his monastery, which was, and even at my tender age of 18, I understood that was an extremely tremendous honor. And he had a tea ceremony for me, a very formal Japanese tea ceremony, and invited me to come stay in the monastery. And I politely declined because I was like, hey, I got to go back to college. I'm only here for 6 months. But anyway, so that was my introduction to meditation in a really serious way. When I was in my early 20s, I went back to Asia and I spent 2 years, maybe a little around 2 years, a little bit more, depending how you count it, primarily in Thailand, in a monastery in southern Thailand, um, under another Buddhist master, definitely a fully enlightened guy, and he had a huge monastery, had about 80 monks in the forest there. They call it a forest monastery. We probably would call it a jungle, living in the jungle basically with monkeys and scorpions and ants the size of your fist. It was just a crazy environment, and we had a lot of fun, did a lot of stuff. Again, 12 to 18 hours a day of meditation on a pretty regular basis. That particular monastery, called Bukokuji, um, they would no that they would basically the first 10 days of every month were silent retreat. So there's no eye contact, no talking, no speaking, no reading, no writing for 10 days of every month. And that was an interesting experience too. So I did that for quite a while. And that was quite an experience too. Um, and then I spent about a few months after I left Japan, I left Thailand after a couple years. My best friends were ordaining, and I decided not to become a full-on monk. And I ended up in Nepal. And I spent maybe 2 or 3 months with a Tibetan Buddhist master in Nepal. And then I was out walking through one of those treks in Nepal one day, and I just sort of stood up and realized, wow, this is like, I want to go home. So I got up and I came back home to the United States. So that was in my mid 20s. Since then, in the more recent past, I spent about 10 years now, I think I'm going on 10 years, 9.5 years, working with a Taoist meditation teacher um, who is quite incredible. And I really feel like I kind of found a spiritual home, I guess you'd say, with Taoist meditation. So again, starting in 2020, we're going to start offering more regular Taoist meditation classes, workshops, in-person workshops, online workshops. There's going to be a lot of materials coming out in 2020 that my teacher has been working on for quite some time. So very excited about that. And absolutely loved my experiences in the Buddhist monasteries, but really when I started to work with my Taoist teacher, felt like there was a real home there for me in a really deep way. So I want to talk a little bit about some basic meditation techniques, why this stuff is important, a little bit maybe about energy systems in the body and how this all fits in with the healing process. And so this is a lecture, and I'm going to skim through this really quickly because honestly, I'm not that interested in it, but I just want to mention there is a ton of research on how meditation affects the mind and the body, and your telomeres can be extended. It's been proven through meditation. In fact, when I was an undergraduate, when I was getting my bachelor's degree, I did my bachelor's thesis on the physiological effects of meditation. And I spent 6 months in England, first at the University of London and then at Cambridge University. And in Cambridge, England. And, you know, I worked with a biochemist named Robin Monroe and was pretty heavy duty, 6 months of internship research, understanding the physiological effects of meditation. And that was my first sort of real serious academic experience. So there's thousands and thousands of research studies that show that meditation is important, whether it's done at Stanford or is done at Cambridge or is done in India. And whether it's about reversing depression or anxiety or making it so that you don't get cancer as often or all kinds of things. And literally, there's more research on this than you could ever read. So I'm skipping through this because it's not really of interest to me anymore. If you need to prove to yourself that meditation is important, you should read all the books on it and get all that stuff figured out. But I'm a little more interested in the actually the reality of all this stuff and how it actually works for people who are ready to understand it. But anyways, there's tons of science behind this, which we're not going to get into. I'm not against the science. I spent many years studying it, but I want to talk a little bit about how this plays out in terms of the healing process and what makes us sick. And the inescapable events, this is a story that my partner tells all the time. We were visiting my Auntie Bernie in Hawaii recently, and we walked in and Bernie has a farm, you would call it, probably, like she's off the grid. She has this farm on the big island of Hawaii. It's beautiful on the side of this volcano, and all this stuff is happening in her farm. But we walked in, and Whitney and I are walking around the property, and Bernie's showing us where the birds are. She has these beautiful doves, these incredible collection of doves that she looks after. And we walk up, and there's one dove that's dead, and it's lying face down in the water trough thing. And Auntie Bernie goes up. You got to imagine this woman's in her mid 70s, pretty tough woman. She just goes up, picks up this dove, and throws it in the compost bin. Well, places it gently and reverently in the compost bin, but she kind of buried it. And then we turn around and we look at the dove cage thing, and there's this egg that's literally hatching as we're watching this dying dove, and we're like, wow, this is like the cycle of life, so this little dove perks out of a egg and this other one is dying. But I think the natural cycles of life and death were pretty much removed from, and this was like shocking for us as city folks to see this happening, but this is really what happens. And for when we're confronted by death or loss in general, it could be a divorce or some intense stress like the birth of a child or a chronic period of many years of overwork. There's enough stress on our system that the body starts to fall apart. And this is how people in general get sick. And then the immune system falters, the GI tract falls apart, people become toxic, and there's a whole sequence of things that happen within this model of functional medicine that I teach quite a bit. But what really gets people, and when you track back health problems, it's usually some kind of intense loss, either a death in the family or a divorce or ending of a relationship. And this sort of depth of problem, is just, this is really why people get sick most of the time. And I think when that's kind of a basic understanding that we should have. Let me just show you this next slide. So when we correct things in functional medicine, we're working with the diet and stress management and exercise and sleep and fixing the thyroid and fixing the adrenals and the GI tract and getting your leaky gut to get repaired and detoxing you from all those horrible chemicals and heavy metals that are saturated your brain right now, getting all that stuff out. And that's great. But in a bigger picture way, when I've spent so many decades working with chronically ill patients, it kind of makes you wonder, well, who are the people that don't get sick? Because we're all exposed to environmental toxins. Who are the people that don't get sick from that? We're all exposed to stress. Everyone has people in their love that they love die. A lot of us every relationship's going to end. Either going to have a divorce or your spouse is going to die, or hope, God forbid, you don't have a loving relationship with a partner, and it's even worse, right? So you're lonely or whatever it might be. So, I mean, we're all confronting these kinds of human issues. But what is it that separates out people from the ones that get sick from these events and the ones that don't? And so I think the real question to ask is not like the model for how people get sick, but how do people not have this make them sick, right? And I think in my general experience talking to human beings for the last 25 years, tens of thousands of people I've interviewed about this who are patients, right? This is my new patient interview. We want to know, what's going on and what are the stresses been like in your life? How have you dealt with those stressors and how has that overlapped or not overlapped with you getting sick? And I think the answer often comes down to, are you spiritually connected or not? And if you're going through a death or a divorce and you feel alone and not spiritually connected, it's going to have a pretty significant health impact. And the more spiritually connected that we can get, the healthier that we can be potentially as we ride through these events of life, right? So I think the spiritual growth process is a foundational grounding element for keeping us physically healthy. And if you're not physically healthy, you have a lot of chronic illness problems, then I think one of the things we can do is use functional medicine to get you physically healthy so that you can then go out and then go through the spiritual growth and emotional growth experiences that are why we're all here, right? So I think this is sort of foundational for physical health and foundational for, the sense of being that, why we're actually here. And so part of this, when we think about this, I'm going to just show a couple of slides here and kind of tie this back to functional medicine a little bit. So this is like an example of a neuron here, the brain, right? When people are stressed and emotionally and spiritually disconnected, the brain doesn't work that well. When people are emotionally stressed and disconnected, they're going to have problems with everything from anxiety to sleep-related issues, et cetera. And I think one of the key elements in us sort of regaining our emotional health is to have a spiritual practice. And you think about toxicity issues, in the liver, and there's liver detox pathways. It's the same kind of toxicity issues can happen on an energetic level. And we see this with a lot of people, right, who are impacted by energies around them and don't really understand why they're not feeling well and when everything in their life is going really well. And I think in my worldview, getting the physical health restored is this platform that we want to establish, but then eventually we want to move into the spiritual growth and spiritual experiences that are really why we're here. We're not here obviously to take a bunch of supplements and we're not here to do a bunch of functional medicine labs. That's not kind of like the point of life, is it? And so we want to, as quickly as possible, move people from this physical health issue struggle and fix those things so they can start to look at the spiritual aspects of life. That's kind of like the goal. So if we think about energy systems in the body, I'm just going to throw up a general slide here because I don't have a ton of slides on this. So in the energy systems of the body are really quite interesting. And, they're certainly you can measure these, and there's different scientists that have, and again, I say this a lot in the past, but let's not worry about that because this is an area where science is so far behind and our ability to understand and measure these things is so far behind that we want to kind of leap out on the limb a little bit and start to think about the deeper aspects of us being able to access these energies and how that can happen. And so when I was first in, well, and I was so young when I was in Japan, I really didn't understand this. But by the time I went to Thailand, I was starting to catch on a little bit. And when I was at the temple in Thailand, it started to occur to me that this meditation thing had something to it. And I looked at it at that stage in my life as a very much like an intellectual puzzle to solve. And I think that when we look at how meditation has been brought from Eastern cultures, what I know is from China over here with Taoism, from Japan and Zen meditation over here to the US, and from Thailand, which we call Vipassana meditation or mindfulness meditation over here in the US. As these techniques have come over to the United States, they've oftentimes been stripped of their spiritual underpinnings and have been turned into more like relaxation techniques or mindfulness techniques or ways to help combat stress and anxiety. And when you go to Asia and you're living in a monastery and you got a bunch of monks around, I mean, meditation is like, I don't know, it's probably like when you're in the military, one of the things that you do maybe is, exercise drills, but that's a pretty small part of your overall military training, right? So when you're a monk, you're meditating, but that's a really small component of the overall thing that you're doing because you're really there for community purposes. You're there to enlighten yourself and others. You're there to help save the planet. You're there for a lot of, bigger reasons. And I think that if we isolate these meditation techniques and just call them stress management techniques, then we're really missing out on the main point of what's going on. And so when we talk about energy systems, we talk about spiritual growth, we're talking about a completely different world, right? We have what I call, the world of humans and this world that we all operate in, and I can get in my car and drive to the store and I can buy something and come home, and that world of human interaction and the things that we see around us. But at the same time, there's obviously a spiritual world that's operating the same time in the same places in the same ways. And I think the purpose of meditation is for us to be able to connect with the spiritual world. And obviously the first step of that is to be able to calm your mind down enough so you can actually stop thinking. And I think that's the first thing that I want to mention in terms of basic meditation techniques. And so if you can sit quietly or stand, to sit down, and you certainly don't have to sit in a full lotus like I did in Japan. By the way, sitting in a full lotus for an hour hurts your knees really badly. I wouldn't recommend it unless you're young and very flexible. But being able to stand or sit or even lie down quietly and have your brain not generate thoughts for a while. How long is a while? I don't know. 10 seconds is pretty good. You can get to the point where you maybe could, be quiet for 6, 7, 8 hours at a time. So when I tell patients that I meditate, I generally wake up on a good day, 3:30, 4 in the morning. 5 in the morning is kind of sleeping in for me. And I have that time, let's say between 4 a.m. and 7:30 a.m. when I start my day, 3 to 4 hours, maybe 5 hours sometimes, where I'm, in this quiet state and I'm able to access the spiritual energies and, before I start looking at labs and start to think about breakfast and all the world of humans kind of stuff that we all have to engage in as part of our regular lives, right? And so what and I started doing this when I was 18. I'm 55, so I sort of built up to the ability to do it for this long. When I was in Japan and I was first learning how to meditate, I was lucky if I could get 10 seconds, maybe 12 seconds without having a thought, and maybe my best moments in Japan, I had maybe like a half an hour without a lot of thoughts. But certainly something that you can try to work on, and I think that's the major goal. And if you can quiet your mind down enough to the point where you're not continually just thinking about things, then your mind will start to experience this spiritual world, I think, quite naturally. In fact, when there's a new baby in our family and you sit and you look at her, I don't know, she's like 4 months old. She's not capable of forming thoughts in terms of language, but she's just sitting there sort of being her, best self, right? And that's what we're talking about. We're talking about not, spacing out or falling asleep or, relaxing, quote unquote. We're talking about you just being aware of your surroundings, but not with this dialogue going on all the time about all the things that you have to do and all the problems that are going on in the world and whatnot. And so I think when I now look at these teachers like I had in Japan and in Thailand, and I think of them, these old Asian men just sitting there hour after hour after hour. You're like, wow, that guy hasn't moved for like 12 hours. How is he doing that? And it wasn't that they were doing that because they weren't meditating to get to a certain state. They were meditating because they were in that state already. And I certainly didn't understand this at the time, but I understand it very well now. So what I mean by that is that you don't sit down and meditate so you can get somewhere or do something. But when you can shut off your mind and achieve a sense of inner peace, this idea of meditation comes quite naturally as a 4-month-old baby just sitting there looking around the room, wondering what's happening. And so the real conundrum here is, how can we turn off the brain for long enough that we can experience this energetic system in the body and the spiritual world? That's really the big problem, the big sort of central question that we're facing. And I think it's the most difficult thing that any of us could do, but it's a very worthwhile project, because once you can achieve this, you'll have the ability to access energy anywhere in the body. You have the ability to help heal yourself. You have the ability to help heal other people. You have all kinds of magical things that occur when you're in this kind of flow and you're, stepping away from that humdrum everyday world of worry that we all, tend to be caught up in. And so for most of the meditation techniques and center around the idea of some kind of a breathing exercise. And the mindfulness with meditation that I did in Thailand, I think, is one of the more simple and easy ways to get going. It's very similar to what the Zen meditation teacher did as well. And Harada Roshi was, no, I should say it the other way around. The fellow in Thailand was very much influenced by Zen Buddhism. And so a lot of the mindfulness work that he taught was based on some of the older Japanese Zen masters as well. And so anyways, it all centers around breathing exercises and being able to pay attention to your breath for extended periods of time and using that as a way to calm your mind. I think the important part of this is that eventually your mind will just stop generating thoughts. It's just a matter of, how long is that going to take? So you just want to work at this for a while. And I think the simplest and easiest meditation that I've learned, and I still do this one occasionally, 18, 28, 38, 48, it's almost 40 years later, I still do the same one, is simply to breathe in and breathe out and count your out breath. So taking a deep breath in, breathing out and counting 1, breathing in, breathing out, counting 2, and counting up to 10. And then if you can make it to 10, you just go back to 1 and start counting again. And usually what I'm asking, when I work with patients in this regard, what I would ask for in the beginning is 2 to 5 minutes a day. So having a 2 to 5 minute a day period where you're sitting down and you're focusing on the in and out breath. And most people can afford to use, to take 2 to 5 minutes a day to do something like that. There's another really great exercise if that one is boring to you or you don't really like it. I think sometimes it's called 4 square breathing, but this one is really good, where you take a deep breath in and you hold it for 4 seconds. You count to 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and you breathe out slowly and then hold your breath out for 4 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4. Then breathe in slowly and hold your breath in for 4 seconds, and then breathe out slowly and hold your breath out for 4 seconds. And especially in the Taoist traditions, they have a really big emphasis on this moment between the in breath and the out breath. And some very special things happen energetically and spiritually while you're in that space between breathing in and breathing out. So that's another simple exercise you can do, the breathing in and breathing out one. And as you get more advanced, then those become easy to practice. You can certainly move on from there. But I think one or both of those is a really good starting point. And 2 to 5 minutes a day. I think the first level of achievement that I reach, certainly, and I see this with a lot of people, is when you can actually do the meditation exercises for 40 minutes at a time. So that's something to build up to. Sort of like if you're running a marathon, you're training for a marathon, eventually you can run 26 miles. So the marathon distance of meditation is about 40 minutes. And if you can sit quietly for 40 minutes, breathing in and breathing out, then you're doing great. You can do that once a day or a couple times a week. You're going to really start to have some interesting things happen in your body. And I think one of the ramifications of this is that you're starting to use your breath to synchronize your brain and calm things down and get the thinking process out so that you can start to experience energy flows in the body and other things that are occurring. Okay, and so I just want to introduce this as an idea. You guys can try either the 10 count breath or the 4 square breath, right, where you take a breath in, hold it for 4, breathe out and hold it for 4. And doing that, on a regular basis, it always seems to work best for human beings if they can do this first thing in the morning. If you have a sleep problem and you're not really great at falling asleep or getting to sleep easily, then this can be something that you can do before you go to bed. Okay, again, 2 to 5 minutes to start with, so you don't feel like you have to be, perfect about it, or there's always 2 minutes in every day that are extra, right? So we don't want to make it burdensome if you have a busy life and you have kids and working full time and that kind of thing and a commute. It's probably not realistic for most people to wake up at 3 or 4 in the morning like I do. My son's in college now, and I have a lot of time to myself, so I'm kind of in a privileged position to be able to do that. Um, but I do believe that the amount of time that we invest into meditation and these kind of practices can make a really big difference. So I want you to just be on the lookout, because we'll be sending out emails in the next few months about some of more detail on the Taoist practices. And I'm going to show you a book you can buy in the meantime, which is just a wonderful book on meditation or on Taoism in general. Let's see here. It's by Star, and it's called the Tao Te Ching. Most of you probably heard that title name before if you haven't read it. Here it is. It's this edition right here, the Tao Te Ching. $8. That's not a bad deal. By Lao Tzu, who is quite the amazing person. What is it? It's rated 4.5 stars. That's pretty funny. Well, whoever didn't like the Tao Te Ching, they talk about people that won't like the Tao Te Ching in the Tao Te Ching, so you can read that chapter. But it's 81 simple little poems almost, or pages of text. I've read this book every day for the last 9 or 10 years. And the interesting thing about this particular edition, it's very well written, or translated, I should say. Jonathan Starr translated it, but I know I've read this book thousands of times. I don't know, like do the math. Like if I've read it every day, let's say 300 times a year times 9 years, I mean, literally thousands of times, right? And every time I pick it up and I read a sentence in it, it's like I've never read it before. It's so strange. It's quite the magical little book. And you can interpret each one of these 81 verses on so many different levels that as your practice develops and you learn more and more about your meditation and the energy systems of the body, this book starts to make more and more sense. So upon first reading, and you can sit down and read it. I don't know, I've never timed myself. You could probably read the whole thing in a half an hour if you were just speeding through it. But upon first reading, just get your general impressions. You may have certain verses that you want to come back to and start to ponder upon. But it's a really wonderful sort of manual that has multi-layer meaning for all of us, I think. And I'll just show you, if you're a little more on the beginning meditation side, there's another really great book I'd recommend, which was my first book, Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. This is a really great book. Where'd it go? Oh, wait a minute. Oh, here it is. Yeah. I still have my original copy from when I was a teenager. Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. This is another really good one if you're just getting started in meditation. And then my third recommendation, if you want to get into this stuff, is The Power of Now. This is such a great book. You've probably heard of this by Eckhart Tolle. He's incredible. And the thing I like about The Power Now is that it's it's not he's someone that we can more easily relate to. He writes in a language that we can more easily understand. He's not an old Asian guy that's a little cryptic and hard to understand. It's very straightforward, more modern, more Western writing. But at the same time, clearly he's had some very deep spiritual experiences and can speak from that in an enlightened way and in a reputable and credible way. So those three books, I would say, the Tao Te Ching, Jonathan Starr, Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, if you want to like a little bit more of a manual on meditation, and then The Power of Now. And if you want to get into, again, sort of entry-level meditation, and these guys, Jonathan Kabat-Zinn, has tons of information. John Kabat-Zinn. So he's got tapes and books and lots of things that are really super helpful. And that's another sort of easy to learn meditation technique Jonathan Kabat-Zinn promotes. And it's basically like a version of mindfulness with breathing, but they call it stress-based, uh, what they call it, stress reduction mindfulness meditation or something like that. SMRB, or I forget. But if you Google Jonathan Kabat-Zinn, there's tons of books, tons of tape series, and information about how you can start to practice meditation using these pretty simple techniques. And they teach classes all over the world as well, you know. So I'm going to wrap it up for tonight, but we're going to have a lot more coming out next year. So if you guys are interested, you know, just pay attention to the emails, and we're going to start with doing some basic Taoist practices. Tonight was more just an introduction to get you up to speed on what 2020 is going to look like. And again, if you're interested in becoming a patient and you want to do some lab work and look at the microbiome and look at, you know, all the things that we see on organic acids and amino acids and get some health problem fixed, you know, we'll be available in the new year, and it'll be great to work with you. Okay, take care everyone and have a great holiday. We'll talk more about this subject in the new year.